So I just got done watching an hour and a half documentary. It's being advertised as a documentary on this trad recovery conference that just happened, I guess, a few weeks ago. I remember seeing it come across my social media feed back in March. I saw a post that I posted back in March just in reviewing for this video. And I was kind of, I don't know, cynical is the right word. I was kind of poking fun at it a little bit before I knew a lot about what it was all about. I have two Facebook friends that were going to be involved with it. Even then, I already knew they were going to be involved with it, but I just kind of maybe mocking. Maybe some people might say I was mocking it, but I was just making a joke out of it. Anybody knows me on social media, I poke fun about almost everything in every group. But my initial reaction to it was that it's just yet another group, right? So that's kind of where I was coming from. Is like presumably a lot of these folks are coming from various groups that they felt they were wronged in some way or abused in some way, a toxic environment, whatever you might want to call it. And so, as part of their healing process, they're joining this group of community to support each other and things like that. My initial thoughts of it was maybe premature, perhaps, but I think I've still held it, even after watching this documentary, that there might still be this this clickiness that I'll get into it later, but I do feel that there is the underlying issue here is this need for some safety, some communal safety. And I think, just broader, coming from my background in psychology is that I think a lot of folks, there's, in terms of, I'm not a therapist, but in terms of various therapy modalities, there is this tradition in modern psychology where, for a person to heal from a lot of brokenness in relationships, part of it is this tendency to rely on external factors to fill in some kind of gap that is needed, perceived to be needed, and so it's trying to find those things outside of the self, rather than trying to look at what are perhaps the deficits internally that's causing the person to look outward to find those solutions. Now, of course, theologically, there is this sort of God-shaped hole that a person might have if they don't have God in their life, and so they do seek that external thing out there, and of course we know that thing to be God, a person, to fill in that desire. I mean, Augustine wrote about that in his City of God, right? That there's this longing to be in the presence of God, something like that, right? So yeah, I do recognize that there is that need, but this kind of need for some safety in community is natural for sure, but the question is that need satisfied in certain groups of very, very specific ways of thinking and perhaps background and all this other stuff. And I guess what I'm getting at is what these folks seem to be trying to break away from was an unhealthy community, but what they probably were conditioned by all those years is to have that need for that kind of community, whether or not the content or the spiritual content or the communal content of it was healthy. That's kind of besides the point. The structure itself and the dynamics of that sociological, ecological culture is kind of how they were conditioned to have to seek out whatever it is, validation, safety, whatever it might be. And now that structure has been rejected, there is this need, it seems, to fill in the gap with yet another structure that's going to, yes, it's new, so it's going to develop its own ecology, its own sociology, its own content of the faith, if you will. And we'll see. I mean, I'm not part of it, so I don't know much about it. So maybe I'm also being prejudicial about it. But I would just caution folks in general who are coming out of some kind of group to join yet another group that's going to develop its own culture, perhaps, and it's going to have its own set of issues, perhaps, as it goes, just like any kind of group, right? And so, anyway, so moving from that, I'm already 5 minutes into this, so I guess I don't usually have a script when I make these videos, and that's what helps me to be more succinct, is that I don't have this program, whatever, but I want to make sure I hit the high points here. The trad recovery name, that was one of the questions that was consistently asked with all the various folks that were interviewed. I think there's 5 interviews. I don't know most of them. I do know Dom Damaso. I do know Jeremiah Bannister. Jeremiah and I go way back. I've never met him in real life, but we go way back to like 2004, 2005 in the old Zanga blogging communities, and that's where I met him, and we've been friends off and on. Well, I mean, I don't think we've ever not been friends. We've been friends since then. And I've stuck it through with him, if you will. If you ask him, he'll tell you the same thing, that I'm the only one that has stayed with him throughout this entire. You've heard of him, but you probably have never heard of me. I like to just be in the background of a lot of things. So I've been around in the tratosphere, the blogosphere, online Catholicism, whatever, apologetics. I've been around since the mid 2000s, but I never aspired to make it big or anything like that. So. You'll see my name in the imprints of the internets since then, when a lot of folks you find today, very very successful personalities, have just started their things in the last few years. But of course they took advantage of the modern technology, and then I just never got into it. So trad recovery as a name, I think it's cool. I mean, it makes sense. All of them, their rationale makes sense, right? It's these kinds of things are designed to get your attention, and so something like trad recovery, it might upset and trigger some folks, but understandably so. It's trying to get your attention, right? Just like basic marketing, just like most of the folks that are probably critics of trad recovery, you use, some of my Facebook friends, you will title a lot of your posts with very clickbaity kind of titles, not just your articles, but just how you advertise articles, books, or whatever it is. It's clickbaity stuff, right? I mean, it's that's why you're using it, because you want folks to pay attention and see if that's something that they're going to move forward, go into the rabbit hole further. The second thing is that trad recovery, I mean, you have to capture it without excluding. Like, you want to be broad enough that you're going to capture the greatest number of folks who could benefit from your message, right? So all of these various folks, whether you're talking about tradismatics, trad light, to sort of conservative tradish type individuals who are like FSSP, Institute Christ the King, and then a little bit further right to that you have those who are flirting with Society of St. Pius X, those who are in the Society of St. Pius X. Then you got the adjacents like the independents, that are closely associated to Society of St. Pius X, have similar arguments, whatever. But then you go further out, and then you have these sort of sedevacantist groups like the Society of St. Pius V, CMRI, Congregation of Mary Immaculate Queen, other groups. There's all sorts of other groups. Whether they elected their own pope or whatever it is, they are sedevacantists. They're clearly schismatics from the perspective of those with in union with Francis, right? They are and that shouldn't be insulting to the folks that are there, because they obviously don't want to be in association with Francis anyway. So yes, they are schismatic to the conciliar church, and they'd gladly take that title on, because they don't want to be associated with Francis, who, just to be clear, I believe is the true pope of the Roman Catholic Church. So whether the whole spectrum of individuals would consider themselves, maybe not perhaps by name, because they find it, if you ask Jerry Madetix, he doesn't really like the term sedevacantist, but he would probably call himself a traditionalist. Like all of them along that whole spectrum would probably consider themselves some form of traditionalist, right? And so whether you like the term or not, you tend to associate yourselves with the kind of mentality, the kind of demographics, the kind of social circles that think along those lines of that identify themselves as traditionalists. So if you're saying you're recovering from that kind of way of thinking, that kind of community, you're recovering from traditionalism, trad recovery makes sense, right? Now, my initial reaction to it was like, it's as if it's an addiction, right? That we're calling it trad recovery. And, I have since kind of sort of changed my view on that. It could be an addiction. There is such a thing as spiritual addiction or church addiction or something like that. Anything can really be an addiction if it's something that sort of takes over your way of thinking to the detriment of your day-to-day responsibilities that you should be taking care of, right? So you could have, if you're not, if your part of your vocation is to be, a family man, you're married, you have children or whatever, and their well-being, their right to flourish is impeded, is that the right word? By your tendency to spend a lot of time debating on, traditionalism and modernism and all this other stuff online or in person or something like that. And this is certainly true within the mainstream church as well. There is such a thing as church addiction, where, I've known some folks in my parish life in the past where you see these folks always at church, every church function, and then they'll tell you about how, their sort of family life is suffering for other reasons, right? They'll attribute the devil or other spiritual issues in the, maybe spend a little less time at the parish, maybe spend a little less time, going to every single parish function and spend more time interacting with your family. Maybe that may be the solution, perhaps. Anyway, that's just an example of how something could be an addiction when it's seemingly a good thing. What's wrong with going to church? What's wrong with participating in church functions? Well, again, if it's to the detriment of what your roles and responsibilities are as part of your vocation, whatever it may be, then, there's clearly an imbalance there. So in the same way, is there perhaps an imbalance by being so integrated or so, your life is saturated with this always, it's almost like that's the safety, or that's the comfort to be debating folks about modernism and the liturgy and all this other stuff, rather than addressing the issues of your life, whatever those issues might be. So yeah, trad recovery, I'm not opposed to that term, but I would suggest, if you're gonna ask for a term, when I was engaging a lot of atheism online, there was a lot of atheists that were trying to make a certain network of atheists many years ago. Atheist Analysis was a channel that was blowing up. I don't know, whatever. It fizzled after a while. They would talk about deconversion. So I would suggest a term called DeTRADversion rather than trad recovery. DeTRADversion. So yeah, deconversion stories. They would talk about that. So I don't know. Maybe it just doesn't roll off the tongue as easily as trad recovery. But anyway, that's my 2 cents about the name. Fine, just continue with the name. Whatever works. Ultimately, if most of the folks are in agreement, that's a good term. Go with it. Majority rules, I suppose. Yeah. So many folks. So it was mentioned in the documentary that a lot of these folks, most of these folks, come from sedevacantist sort of cults, sedevacantist, cultish type behaviors of groups like sedevacantist CMRI, Society of St. Pius V, maybe something like that. Well, certainly the CMRI has a history with cultish, true cultish behavior, because the CMRI was founded by Francis Schuchart. The whole group, CMRI, it was a lay group that started in the 1960s or 70s or something. I think it was the early 70s, right after the Second Vatican Council. Or maybe it was, anyway, look at the dates. I don't remember it from memory, but it was a lay association that was founded. Francis Schuchart was the founder of it. Eventually, he became some kind of bishop or whatever it is. And there was some abuses that came out of that, drug use, sexual abuse, all sorts of different things. You can look that up on your own. So that group kind of tried to rebrand, just kept the name CMRI, but somehow trying to disconnect themselves from the past, the abusive past that they had. So trad recovery makes sense, because if you're talking about cult deprogramming, there's many documentaries out there about how cults operate and how to get out of those kinds of situations. The most notable, I think, the documentary that I watched several years ago was the one about, what was it, Rimini? Rimini was her name, Leah Remini, who was a former member of the, I forget what they're called. They're the Scientologists, right? And so she had a documentary about deprogramming from that group. I want to get back to kind of addiction to clickiness. I really do think, though, there's something to reflect upon this kind of addiction to being part of a clique. I think there's just this kind of nastic tendency to want to be part of the knowing, the ones who know the secret salvation, the secret truth, right? So there is this tendency for, I think, a lot of personality types to want to be on the inner circle of, to be in the inside, being in the know, or whatever it may be, right? It's not this kind of like being content or happy with this kind of universal, everyone's welcome kind of stuff, because I think underlying a lot of the personality traits in traditionalism, and this is my opinion, you can agree or disagree, whatever, is that there really is this underlying, like, salvation is very narrow, right? So that might be theologically correct, because narrow is the way to salvation and wide is the way to destruction. That is, the concept is scriptural, right? So, but there's other ways of looking at that. If you look at Peter Kraft, he says, well, if anyone who has lost salvation is already too many, right? So it doesn't necessarily mean there's a numeric value to that's just, I'm not saying that's what I believe, but I think that's a valid way perhaps of looking at it, that it's a tragedy if any soul is lost, if any at all, right? So there's, on the one hand, you have kind of the Father Baron universalism. Well, I shouldn't say universalism, because that's debatable, but just this idea that hell is empty or whatever, versus the opposite extreme of, like, almost extra ecclesiam nulla salus to the Feeneyite way of thinking, that you always want to restrict. It's like there's this tendency of the traditionalist mind to want to restrict. It's one thing if it's theologically correct that there is a strict restriction. That objective truth is true whether you apprehend or whether you agree with it or not. That's different from it seems like there is this personality type or tendency to want to restrict, like the salvation is only for these. If you do X, Y, and Z, and this is the program, and not coincidentally, these kinds of folks have those sets of behaviors down pat. Now they'll still be self-deprecating. They'll still say I'm a filthy sinner and all this other stuff. But there is, again, this comfort in I've done these things. I mean, it's okay. No personal judgment on any particular individual. If you feel convicted by this assessment, then maybe that's something to think about. Is it like the Pharisee? Is it like the Pharisee when he's like, you know, thank you, Lord, that I am not like that, sinner back there, the tax collector. I pay my tithe. I do this, like listing out all their virtues, but the one that's ultimately in that scenario is righteous before God is the one that's humble in the back, recognizes their own sin, and in their humility won't even raise their eyes up, and it's like that kind of a thing. Whereas the other person's like beating their breast is like, look what I've done for you. I've done all my 17 rosaries today and all this other stuff. It's there's a pride. There's a pride there in your spirituality. And I won't say that that's never been me. I certainly have been part of a lot of these ways of thinking in the past. So yes, so I think there is an addiction to clickiness and group think mentality. The fourth thing I want to point out is I think there is sometimes, and it might not be true for a lot of folks, but I think sometimes there is this spiritual unrest, uneasiness. Some people have this restless leg syndrome where it's like, it's always agitated, it's always sort of stimulated for some reason, right? And it's uncomfortable. So I think there is a pocket or group of individuals, for whatever reason, early childhood trauma, who knows what, where there is this spiritual uneasiness, or perhaps it's even psychological, a mixture of both, one or the other, who knows, until you explore it further in your own situation, this uneasiness, and you see these folks kind of floating from group to group, and it's always like, okay, I found the group, and then you try to settle down, and you're fine for a little while, and it's like then something happens where it's like, no, this is not right. And so you start exploring other avenues, and you're like, oh, maybe that one, go there. Same cycle over and over again. It's like, it's like how some folks shop for parishes. That's one thing, right? But then I think there is this shopping for a certain way of spirituality. And the problem I see with this, I think, would be that there's this implicit in the behavior. It's implicit to me that it's on the one hand they're seeking truth. They'll say they're trying to find truth. They're trying to find the whole Catholic faith, the pristine Catholic faith, whatever that may be. But then they sort of judge the community or the group based on their conceptions. Right? At some point, they'll find that wanting, and so then they'll seek out another kind of group that fits that kind. So it's like, are you really seeking truth, the wholeness of truth? Because then it assumes that you already know what the fullness of pristine Catholicism is. And so then you're holding that standard up against all these groups, and they're all wanting in some way, shape, or form. And so I think that's some kind of restless leg syndrome. It's like restless Catholic spirituality syndrome. I don't know. Something to think about. I don't know if there's substance to that. And the last point is something I've been saying a lot lately, for a while actually. I think all at the bottom, at the end of the day, all conversions, one way or another, spirituality here, that way, politically this way or that way, are all preveniently, if I can borrow a term from theology, it's all emotion, it seems to me. And the example I've been giving is I met Dr. What is his name? Francis. Anyway, maybe I won't mention his name, but anyway, I've mentioned it on my Facebook. So I met him at Catholic Answers last year. He was a speaker there. He's a convert from Protestantism, and I was asking him a question just before his talk, and and his response was interesting to me. He said that the interesting thing is, all these years as I was a Protestant, I never saw the cogency or like the you know, the the truth of the Catholic apologetic until a certain point, right? Nothing changed in the content of those apologetics all those years. It's just almost like, one day it made sense, and then he came back to the Catholic Church. Now I'm pretty sure it was a sort of a lengthy process, but he described it as it's almost like this kind of light bulb just came on, right? And so that's pretty insightful, I think, for a self-reflection, and I think that's true for all folks for the most part. There are cognitive, emotional, psychological blocks that prevent us from making decisions for one way or another for lots of things, a lot of things in our lives. I would say almost everything in our lives. The reason why we don't, move forward with that thing that in our gut we know we should do, there are these blocks, emotional, psychological, whatever it may be. And until those blocks are removed, whether you say it's the prevenient grace that removes that block, or your own way of thinking cognitively, or your own emotions psychologically, that's until you're ready on a sort of human level, whether the cause of that readiness is grace, or some other thing, some other process, those things need to be removed first. And so apologetics is sort of a partial cause, I would say, but I don't think logical argumentation is the primary reason why people may change their minds one way or another. They have to be sort of emotionally ready first, and once they're then ready, they either move towards it. They'll read more books to sort of fill in the sort of the intellectual, logical piece of it, until they finally get there. And then, of course, they develop their conversion stories. And then, it's hard to say whether a lot of those rational explanations later on, as they develop their conversion story, if they go that route of sharing their conversions, it's hard to say whether those things were the true cause of the whole conversion process, or if that later on is just sort of this intellectual justification of the whole process, which ultimately what was fueling that movement was, well, primarily grace, I would say, but a lot of it was emotion. And somebody was commenting recently, they were amazed about a lot of folks who are very classically, philosophically trained, and now they're atheists. And when you analyze their argumentation against the faith, it's very basic philosophical arguments that would easily be refuted if they were themselves engaging with someone who was an atheist at the time, right? If they were still a theist and a Catholic, it's such infantile, I guess you can say, argumentation. Well, it shouldn't surprise us. Again, emotions come first, logic comes second, I would say. So this video is already longer than I had anticipated. So that's, I would say, it's my reaction to that documentary. I would just, I would add maybe, for me, I've never joined a group. The closest thing I was involved with after my reversion in 2004 was being involved with Opus Dei through spiritual direction and going to the retreats and I never joined Opus Dei. I, spent a lot of time with a lot of different groups. I've been to charismatic groups. I've done the life team thing. I was in the traditionalist group for many years. I was the, former president of Una Voce San Bernardino. So we were promoting the Latin Mass. We started a Latin Mass in Paris, California. It went around for about 7 years. We promoted, we had resources, we raised some money, we got vestments, all sorts of different things related to the Latin Mass. So I've been in the thick of that group and many other groups. I've been to so many different conferences. I think when we box ourselves into a certain way of Catholicism, there is a social pressure, like social psychological pressure, to think like the whole group. And so it makes it very difficult because you don't want to be in the out crowd, right? You don't want to be alienated. So there is this pressure to think within the group, right? And broadly speaking, sentiri cum ecclesia, we should think with the church, right? But the church has historically been so vast in its expression of the faith praxis, not necessarily the content of the faith, the doxology of the faith is universal, but the practice of the faith is could be cultural. It could be in things that are non-essential. There are cultural variations over the centuries and throughout various regions. So when we box ourselves into a certain cliquey way of thinking, then we don't appreciate sort of the beauty of the way other styles of spirituality that are legitimate and have a long tradition or whatever it may, even if it doesn't have a long tradition. There was a time when there was no Jesuits, and then there were Jesuits. There was a time when there were no Franciscans, and then there were Franciscans. Or name all the types of spirituality in Western Christianity, Western Catholicism, and there was a time that they didn't exist before, and then there was a time. So they were all new, and there were probably folks there that were like, no, not that kind, not that style. And look how long how far they've come along. So with that, I hope this has been helpful for some. I don't know. God bless you. Until next time.